So let's get to the main event here and introduce Senator Nelson. Bill Nelson is a fifth-generation Floridian who has held office in his home state for more than 4 decades. Ironically, his grandparents homesteaded in the early 20th century on land that is today the Kennedy Space Center. I say ironically because just days before the Space Shuttle Challenger's ill-fated launch in 1986, Bill Nelson himself spent 6 days in space orbiting the Earth aboard Space Shuttle Columbia. He says his time in space gave him a unique perspective on Earth's environment, which is one of the reasons he wants, in part, to talk today about the dumping of excess fresh water into the Indian River Lagoon and the St. Lucie estuary, which is causing green toxic algae that is killing oysters in seagrasses. He'll be the first to tell you that Congress can't seem to get anything done, and there's a good chance we'll hear something about sequestration and other means of trimming the budget. Before being elected to the United States Senate in 2000, Bill Nelson served as a U.S. representative, a state legislator, and a state cabinet officer. There's speculation that, even though he said no, he might, just might, run for governor in 2014. However, far be it from us to speculate about that. If he doesn't bring it up, just ask him. And right now, please join us in welcoming Senator Bill Nelson.
Good afternoon, and I am so delighted to have my family here. Our daughter lives in Martin County. Our son came down from Orlando. Grace and I drove down together, and without breaking any speed limits, I made it to the door from our door in 2 hours and 20 minutes. And I always enjoy coming here because you all are not only the ones that are plugged in, you understand what's happening, but this is an illustration, as the President just said, of a group that is bipartisan, consensus building. You continue to be a model of bipartisanship. We've got a room full here of citizens with opposing points of view, and what you do is come together for reasonable and civil discussion. Now, you would think that Congress could do the same. I was just in Stewart just a few days ago, and we're searching for the right solutions for the Indian River Lagoon. There are dangerous conditions. The President has outlined some of them in the river and in Lake Okeechobee. It's not just the dumping of the water, it's upwards of 16 feet in the lake. The pressure is getting too great. They have to dump the water. But when they dump the water, it adds to the already polluted runoff that comes into the river. And part of the solution to this is to finish the Everglades restoration plan. So I'm going to tell you about that. So we updated the Water Resources Development Act. It's called WRDA. You'll hear the acronym WRDA. And the bill authorizes those new projects that you see. Thank goodness the South Florida Water Management District just passed their okay for what is known as the Central Everglades Project. We're going to try to get, since that is not embraced yet by the Corps of Engineers, before the end of the year, and I have it worked out, that if they will get their chiefs, the chief engineer's report, out in time before we pass the WRDA bill. Then it will be considered not a new start after the water bill has been passed and signed into law. And what this bill does, it updates flood protection, waterbound navigation, our ports, specific restoration projects. This is for all over the country, but of course here we're interested in what it's doing in Florida, and it includes the essential projects for Everglades restoration. It will help protect you all here in the Palm Beach area from the toxic discharges from Lake Okeechobee, and it'll help Congress keep the promise that it made 13 years ago to restore the Everglades, which is half federal, half state. This extraordinary ecosystem is not only an important part of Florida's economy, but it is part of Florida's heart and soul. And it's vital that those of us in Congress keep our promise and put the Everglades back as much as we can toward the way that Mother Nature designed it. Well, we passed a water resources bill overwhelmingly and bipartisan, and that was last May in the Senate. But you wouldn't know it. That bill is still sitting around. It's waiting for the House of Representatives to act. The Indian River Lagoon is suffering. You are suffering. And because, yet again, important legislation has stalled in Congress. Now, I can tell you the two members of Congress that are here, they are in favor of getting that water bill right up. I can't tell you how hard Michelle McGovern, that works, well, there she is, that represents me here in the Palm Beach, West Palm Beach office, how she's worked, how our Chief of Staff, Pete Mitchell, have worked on trying to get this. And it is stuck in the House of Representatives. But that's not the only thing. Congress can't seem to get a lot done. It's disappointing to see such a rigid ideology and such political partisanship get in the way of what the American people expect and deserve from those they elected to serve them. And the latest example is a small group of folks that are threatening to shut down the federal government if we don't repeal the health care reform law some people derisively term Obamacare. Now think about that. Really? Shut down the United States government because you're not getting your way? That's how partisan and extreme things have become. Look what's happened in our attempt to fix our country's broken immigration system. And as I tell you about this, you'll hear about the bipartisan effort that was made. The system is broken. The last time we tried to fix it, I was a young congressman under President Reagan. Then we had about 2 million undocumenteds in the country. Now it's close to 11 million. And the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill, it's a historic piece of legislation. It's truly bipartisan. It was crafted together initially by 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans. That included my colleague, Marco Rubio, who, by the way, the two of us have a very good personal and professional relationship. We just held a hearing together of the Senate Commerce Committee in Apalachicola, Florida, on the problems there in Apalachicola Bay. And so here is a truly historic piece of legislation. It passed overwhelmingly in the Senate, and the House simply refuses to take it up. Now, if you dig in behind that, why? The House of Representatives has the votes to pass it. But the Speaker of the House says he will only pass something if he has a majority of the votes of his caucus. And of course, there's a subset of the Republican caucus of the House, numbering from anywhere from 60 to 100, that are insisting that we are not going to have immigration. As I met with Marco last week in our joint hearing, he was telling me some of the things that, as he's visiting Tea Party groups around the state, how they are expressing their displeasure with him. My advice to him was, keep it up. Keep it up. Well, you don't have to look any further. Look at the transportation bill. We took it up just before the August recess. It's a bill that's normally pretty easy to pass. I mean, after all, it's money to build roads and bridges and maintain our highways. And who in the world could be against that? Well, what was a bipartisan bill that had come out with a huge bipartisan vote out of the committee, overnight suddenly became a hot-button partisan issue in both the House and the Senate because of its funding level. It was not cut sufficiently to meet the sequester level. And as a result, the rigid ideological lines tightened, the partisanship gripped. We could not get 5 votes to add to the 55 Democratic votes to get 60 to break the filibuster just to consider the bill, just to pass the motion to proceed to get to the bill. And so we can't get the transportation bill up. But every now and then you take it into your own hands. You remember when the sequester happened to hit the air traffic controllers? You remember when it started the lines of TSA and the air traffic to suddenly being delayed, 3-hour waits? The people of this country didn't like that, and they spoke out, and suddenly that translated into political action, that sequester level got reversed as to the level that it should have been. All right? What about the air traffic controllers at small airports? They were going the way too. That affects you here in Palm Beach County, because all of a sudden they were not going to have contract controllers at the Boca Raton Airport and at the Stewart Airport. Just ask the managers of those airports if that's safe with all of those executive jets flying into those 2 small airports. Well, as I see it, perhaps the greatest issue that's bogged down by the gridlock is whether Congress can find a balanced way to reduce our deficit. And this is going to have to be a priority for many reasons, not the least of which is the sequester and the budget stalemate that is adversely affecting you and so many Americans. Now, I want you to know I approach all of these problems generally as an optimist. But when I look around Washington these days, all I can see is rigid partisan ideology. The members of Congress have failed to put aside their political differences and find common sense solutions to our nation's pressing financial woes. It was never intended that this sequester go into effect. A meat cleaver across the board, budget cutting, and it's a charade. Such across-the-board budget cuts aren't the right thing to do. They do real damage to everyday people's lives. And during the tense debt ceiling negotiations 2 years ago, which was my last speech here, and I reported this to you 2 years ago, Congress at that time was faced with either letting the government default or allowing the across-the-board cuts to go into effect. Obviously, with that choice, I wasn't going to let the government go into default and not be able to pay its bills. Now, I don't want to get down in process too much, but basically, here's what happened. They had come through that summer of negotiating with the president, and nothing had come out. And so finally, a last-minute measure was put together that would cut immediately, over a decade, $1 trillion of spending. And on top of that, a super committee, 6 from the House and 6 from the Senate, was formed to come up with a budget solution to raise at least another $3 trillion, or a total of at least 4 over the 10-year period. Maybe following along the lines back then of names that you've heard, like Simpson-Bowles Commission or the Domenici-Rivlin suggestions. And what happened to nudge that super committee, this meat cleaver, this guillotine, was put over their heads to drop if they failed to reach agreement. And the guillotine was another $1 trillion of cuts, but not in a rational, intelligent way. It was to drop across the board for all discretionary spending, half in defense and half in non-defense. Not a way to do budgeting. And surely that was going to urge the super committee of 12 people. It didn't. And so since then, many of us have offered ideas on ways to get rid of the sequester. I have voted 6 times since then to get rid of the sequester. I have co-sponsored 3 pieces of legislation to get rid of the sequester. Yet some of our most partisan members of Congress still won't put aside their political differences in favor of finding the common sense solution. And so what happens is that it hurts you, it hurts our cities, it hurts the counties, it hurts the states. It's already hurting our national defense and our nation's ability to compete economically with other countries. And if these cuts continue in the way they are, I didn't say spending cuts, I said the sequester across the board cuts, then we're going to be in serious trouble. How many of you have come to see me about a particular project that you want funded? How about the NIH grants at Scripps? We had Dr. Francis Collins, the head of NIH, come talk to us. 700 medical research grants cannot be issued by NIH just for the remainder of this fiscal year up to the end of September 30th. 700 because of the cuts imposed upon NIH. You know that includes all of the research going on cancer, on diabetes, on Alzheimer's, on amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, and you can go on, and some of the amazing breakthroughs. Why the grants? Because they go out to the medical schools and they go to the medical research institutions like Max Planck and Scripps. And it's the genius of America that through their research they start finding the solutions. How many of you came to me to talk about this airport right out here? How many of you came to me to talk about the seaport, the port of Palm Beach? What about a mental health program? What about a seniors feeding program? What about a road or a water plant? I could keep going on and on. What you need to do, any of you who care about any of these kind of things, including your national security, you need to go see those people in the Congress who continue to support the sequester and say this is not the way to run a railroad. And only if you will do it, and don't go talk to their assistants, as well-meaning as they are, you've got to get in their face so that they understand the passion, the concern, the worry that so many of you have come to me to talk about. Now, both sides of the political aisle can continue to point fingers at one another, but isn't it about time that we started talking about solutions instead of who to blame? Now, there was one bright, shining little moment of optimism that I saw. We were about to fall into a constitutional crisis over the question of the president's executive branch appointments. We couldn't get a number of them up because there was a filibuster against the executive branch appointments. And we were about to exercise a little used 3 times in the history of the Senate constitutional option that you could get those appointments up through a majority vote instead of the supermajority of 60 votes to break the filibuster. There were a lot of moderate members of the Senate, both Republican and Democrat, that didn't want that to happen because that could precipitate a constitutional crisis. We met as the Senate in the old chamber. No press, no staff. 97 of the 100 senators. And we listened to each other. There were only 3 senators absent. And for 3.5 hours, we listened to each other. And nobody left. And toward the end, you could see the consensus start to emerge as to how you could solve the problem and avoid the constitutional crisis. And that was done with regard to the president's executive branch appointments under the theory that the president ought to have his team in place in order to be able to govern. And so as you get into this idea of budgeting, we need the targeted budget cuts of wasteful government spending coupled with realistic tax reform. Coupled with realistic tax reform, we need to replace the sequester with more targeted cuts, and you need to identify what that is and say what it is. Now, put simply, we need a budget agreement. We passed a budget in the Senate. We passed it by the overwhelming vote of 50 to 49. and there it sits. So if common sense doesn't prevail in Congress pretty soon, irreparable damage is going to be done. And you can name almost any issue, and the progress report is the same. Gridlock. I'm going to give you one final example. The NASA bill. Never in the history of Congress has it been partisan. It's not bipartisan. NASA is nonpartisan. And as I have had the opportunity to help that little program along, it's been the last NASA bill that set the course of the future of where we're going. We're going to Mars. We passed it unanimously in the Senate. We passed it with a 3/4 vote in the House. I'm sad to report to you that the NASA bill in the Commerce Committee was a vote of 13 to 12. Straight partisan lines, because it did not meet the lower sequester level. And I can tell you that our human and unmanned space program cannot do the things that it has to do. Well, we have to turn this around. We can't have this excessive partisanship and rigid ideology that's gripping the country. We can't have it infect your lives any longer. And just return to something that is so self-evident: common sense and bipartisanship. And then we can keep hardworking Americans from having to continue to face furloughs. We can reform the tax code. We can even send humans to Mars. I want to close with this. You all know, as the President told you, that I had this extraordinary experience a long time ago in the early part of the space program. A lot of my public service is informed by the experience that I had in the window of a spacecraft looking back at Earth. As I looked back on our planet, I did not see political divisions, and I didn't see religious divisions, and I didn't see racial divisions, and I didn't see ethnic divisions. What I saw was that we were all in this together. If we could just remember that, we'd get a lot more done. Thank you very much.
If you have a question ready for Senator Nelson, please hold it up right now, and our volunteers will come by and pick those questions up. Senator Nelson, thank you again for your service to our country and to our state, and thank you once again for coming by and visiting us and informing us what's happening in Congress and also what's not happening in Congress. As a small token of our appreciation, we'd like to have you take this gift. Thank you very much. And as you know, what we're going to do right now is we're going to have the students stand up, and they're going to ask the first question. And you've been here before.
Yes,
you've done this before, so you know that the student questions are typically the hardest questions. So be prepared.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name's Tom. I'm from Lake Worth campus. I'm the Student Government Association Vice President. My question is, do you think the economic recovery will continue, or is it still unstable? Or do you think the job market will continue to improve?
For now, going on 3 years, we've had private sector job growth. over the course of the last 3 years, we have come, well, let me trace for you what happened to the economy. In September of 2008, is this on? In September of 2008, we had already come through, Bear Stearns had gone down. And then Lehman Brothers went down in 2008. And that started us into an economic death spiral. You will remember the famous statement by the then Treasury Secretary, Hank Paulson, in the latter part of the Bush administration, begging the Congress to enact emergency legislation known as TARP, known as the Troubled Assets Relief Program. And that program helped keep the financial nose above the waterline. And then a good example of bipartisanship, by the way, was the handoff from one Republican administration to the new Democratic administration, all while this crisis is happening. We were literally going into a financial death spiral, and companies and employers were shedding right and left. And we had that huge, for the next year and a half, plunge of job losses. Since then, for the last 3 years, including this previous month's report that just came out, you've seen the private sector job growth go, not robustly, but steadily. So the economy is recovering. Now, that doesn't mean that all pockets of the economy have recovered, because clearly that's the case. What you're seeing, for example, in Florida, however, is the tourism industry has returned. There's a great deal of money that's made. People still come and enjoy our natural attributes of the environment and our beaches. You're beginning to see employers here hire, and you're also seeing the Florida statistics of unemployment continue to go down, as is the national unemployment. Florida, if I recall correctly, is somewhere around 7.1% unemployment. The national is somewhere around 7.5%. So we continue to improve, but by no means are we out of the woods. Now, I'm going to make a prediction to you. If we will do what I have talked to you about today and get a budget agreement, this national economy will take off like a rocket, because of the inspired new confidence in businesses in America of that the leadership is finally getting its act together and can actually act on a budget. Thank you for your question.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, Forum Club members. I am Darlene Rodick. I'm the president of the Student Government Association, as well as president of the mock trial pre-law competition team of the Boca Raton campus at Palm Beach State College. Sir, my question is this. It is very discouraging to see the county becoming more blue and red and divided. In Washington, it's becoming worse in this way. Is there any way that you could try to bring us together or encourage us to become more united?
Well, that's what I've been talking about for the last 25 minutes. And I hope you will take to heart what I said. Because what has happened, let me just give you the political analysis. And this is, I have no pride of authorship on this. This is just my observation, but I think you can hear this from a lot of Republican as well as Democratic prognosticators. The excessive partisanship and the race to the extremes has been brought about by not only gerrymandered congressional districts where the outcome is predetermined before you ever have the election as to which party is going to have the particular congressional district. And therefore, that member, if it's a congressional district that is not representative of the community as a whole, they are voting just for the interest of that gerrymandered constituency. And so a lot of the things that we talk about today, they don't influence them nearly as much for the next election as playing the tune that is called by those particular interests in their congressional district. Now, when you add to that the phenomenon that we have seen arise, particularly since 2010 elections, which is the rise and power of the Tea Party as an influence on the Republican primaries, then what you have is all the more a skewed producing of candidates that go into the general election. I want to give you an example, and Indiana is a perfect example. Longtime United States Senator, Republican, well-respected and an extraordinary accomplished senator, Dick Lugar, went in the previous election. He didn't even have any opposition. This time, however, the Tea Party put up a fellow named Richard Murdoch against Senator Lugar because Dick Lugar was not pure enough. He was, and this was one of the things that they accused him of in the Republican primary in Indiana. He cooperated with Democrats. And as a result, what happened in the Republican primary? Richard Murdoch won the primary going away with over 60% of the vote in a small turnout Republican primary that did not reflect the community at large. Now, what happened then in the general? The Democrats had nominated moderate Democratic Congressman Joe Donnelly, and then Murdoch in the general election, he was one that had said something on one of the debates about a woman can't get pregnant if she's raped, you know, and that just kind of blew the doors open. And so Joe Donnelly is the senator. Now, if you think I'm being partisan, I'm going to give you another example in the Democratic Party. Go back to the year 2006 in Connecticut. Joe Lieberman, longtime Democratic senator from Connecticut, had been voting some with the Bush administration. And the liberals in the Democratic Party in Connecticut took offense of that. So they put up a fella in the Democratic primary, and Joe Lieberman got beat because he wasn't liberal enough. Only because Connecticut has unusual laws was after that primary, Joe was able to declare himself an independent and then run in a three-way race between the Republican, the Liberal Democrat, and Joe as the independent, and he was elected for another 6-year term as an independent. And of course, Joe continued as chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. He caucused with the Democrats. Now, this is a part of the polarization. This is, in fact, a fact. This is happening. It's not going to change until you all start insisting that people start looking at the broad picture instead of the narrow interest of whatever is that interest that is calling the tune to be played.
Thank you, Senator. Senator, guess what the first question is?
I hope it's not the same thing I've talked about. I'm about to lose my voice.
Senator Nelson, are you considering running for governor of the state of Florida?
I have said consistently the following, and I will continue to say that. I have no plans to run for governor. I have no intention of running for governor. I've got my hands full in the Senate.
Senator Nelson, let's change the focus to overseas. In light of all the bloodshed in Egypt right now, should the U.S. halt, at least temporarily, military aid to Egypt?
This is where we're damned if you do and damned if you don't. It is clearly in our interest that General al-Sisi gets the place stabilized. And it is clearly in our interest that we encourage him, once it's stabilized, to have a free and fair election. And it is clearly in our interest that it be a pluralistic election where all parties can be heard. Obviously, in the previous elected government, the Brotherhood, they weren't paying attention to the people. They had put all of their folks in, they had kicked everybody out, and they were continuing to go down a radical path of radical Islam. That obviously is not in our interest, nor in the interest of our allies in the region, not only of which is Israel, which of course is obvious, but it's also our great friend, King Abdullah in Jordan. Now, where is this going? This is a fine line that the government of the U.S. has to walk, and it's going to be messy. Ever since the Arab Spring started, you haven't seen anything that's anything other than messy, including what's going on in Syria right now. All right, if I expand your question, what should we do about Syria? Do we want American boots on the ground in Syria? I don't think so. To what extent does the U.S. get in and support the so-called freedom fighters when it's hard to define who the freedom fighters are? And the multiplicity of different groups, including Al-Qaeda, that are coming in and trying to influence that outcome. Obviously, a stabilized Syria is extremely important to us, particularly to Israel and to Jordan, and then, of course, to all the other surrounding countries. We will have support from Turkey. That's why they wanted us to bring in a Patriot battery in southern Turkey to help protect them. Eventually, the chaos, political chaos, known as Lebanon, is only going to be settled down until you get a stabilized Syria. And I simply, nor anyone, can predict where that's going. I'll tell you, we got some good people in the region, because the ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro, used to be a member of the Nelson team for 6 years, and he's the best of the best. He speaks fluent Hebrew and Arabic. He was the one, by the way, that got into it back under the Brotherhood, Egypt, that when they were attacking the Israeli embassy, he got directly to the White House, who got directly to the Egyptian military, and they then went in and prevented the attack on the Israeli embassy.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. We're going to come back to the United States now after being overseas for a little bit. Will it be Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden in the Democratic primaries in 2016?
This is one that I'm damned if I do and damned if I don't. Joe Biden was one of my best friends in the Senate. I don't get to see him very much because naturally I respect that arm's length and I don't go pester him all the time. Hillary Clinton, our daughter Nan Ellen and Chelsea grew up together. And of course, the relationship between the Nelson family and the Clintons is close as well. So you see, I'm in a very difficult position. This is what I expect to happen. If Hillary decides to run and announces it within a reasonable time, I would expect that Joe would not get into the race. And what would be the future for Joe, who has a lot of experience and corporate knowledge that you don't want to lose? I don't know at that point. I would think that the case, if Hillary decides that, and I don't know that she has, just look at what you have to go through to be president these days. Does she want to put herself and her family through that? But I suppose that the compelling nature of the women of America saying that we want the first woman president, I suspect that will rule at the end of the day.
Senator Nelson, please comment, give us your perspective on the Edward Snowden situation.
Edward Snowden committed treason. This doesn't have anything to do with being a whistleblower. I know all of this because I helped write the law that is protecting your privacy and at the same time trying to protect us from the bad guys doing us in, which they're trying every day. And I have never been so amazed at the lack of understanding by the press of America, where they take little snippets of information and suddenly draw conclusions, such as, I heard no less than Willie Geist about a month ago on Morning Joe, and he's obviously someone that's rocketing up in the communications world. I heard him say, well, the U.S. government's got all of our emails and they're listening to our telephone calls. Not so. What they have is the business records of the phone company, which a lot of people have the business records of the phone company. All that is a record that from such and such a number, a call was made at such an hour to such and such a number, and the duration of the call. No identities. It's not until that one of the analysts sees reason to believe that one of the terrorist targets, and by the way, you cannot get the communication of an American legally under the law unless you get a court order. And that's by the FISA court that you've been told by the news media is a star chamber, that it's already made up its mind. Let me tell you, it's anything but. It's a group of federal judges that are selected by the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court that sit as a court. They rotate. And the reason there's such a high degree of approval of the request of the intelligence community is before that final approval is ever given, they've already counseled with them, this is deficient, I'm not going to hear this, you go back and change this. So it's a perfected request for a court order on what? That there is probable cause that there is an act against the security interest of the United States. That's the probable cause upon which a federal judge will issue the order that then they can go in and start to receive the content of that communication. In this case, it would be an email, or to start to listen to that telephone number. So, give you an example. Bad guy in the Middle East. Are we listening to his calls? You bet we are. He's not an American citizen. If he's an American citizen, bad guy, we can't go listen to his calls even if he's over there in the middle of an Al-Qaeda compound, if he's an American citizen, unless we get a court order. And that's not even an American citizen. That's an American person, which means somebody that's a foreigner that's here legally with a green card or on a tourist visa legally. We can't listen to them either unless you get a court order. And so the example, here's the bad guy. We're listening to him, or we're watching his telephone calls, and he suddenly makes a call to a number in New York City. Now we go into the records, and of course we see what happened on this number. This number in New York City is suddenly calling Denver and here and there. So they go to the court. We have reason to believe. The court gives them the order. That's how the Times Square bombing was averted. And there are over 50 cases that have been averted by virtue of the program that is in place. Now, how do you minimize the mistakes? You have to give the analyst some judgment, but that's a very select few people at top executive level authority in the NSA, the National Security Agency, that have the judgment that they believe there's probable cause to go get from, in this example, the phone records, and to see where else that person, that American person, has been calling. They're not getting the content yet. And then, if there's the reason to suspicion that they've called a bunch of other terrorist numbers, go to the court and ask for the order to start listening to those communications. It's the same thing law enforcement does. If they think that you have committed a crime and they need to go into your house to get evidence, they can't go into your house. Your privacy is protected by the United States Constitution, save for a judge giving law enforcement an order to go in. Now, I'll just conclude with this. This thing has been so misunderstood. Edward Snowden has milked this thing for all it's worth, and in large part it's under misunderstanding of the American public because they're being dished out a bunch of things. Now, having said that, this is the great challenge that we have in a new era where all of these people that operate by stealth and deception are trying to hurt us. How do we go after them and still protect our God-given, unique privilege in this country? And that is the American protections for privacy, guaranteed by the Constitution. And this isn't the first time that this will be tested. It will continue. You better hope that the three branches of government are working. where the judicial, constantly a check and balance, the legislative, constantly a check and balance of oversight on the executive branch, as well as having the prerogative of writing the law or changing the law. That's the unique check and balance in our system of government.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. We have time for one final question, and we're going to make this final question a speed round, meaning one-word answers. So are you ready? They get
No.
They get
You
progressively
can't-
harder.
You can't answer questions with one word. Now, that's getting to the degree of ridiculous.
First
Go
question.
ahead and ask your questions.
Facebook or Twitter?
Both.
That's one word. Will you come back and address the Forum Club in 2015?
I will, unless something intervenes.
And final question, this is the hardest one. Are you picking the Florida Gators or the Miami Hurricanes on September 7th?
Gators.
Thank you, Senator Nelson, very much.